right, hello and welcome to Papier Sal. I'm useless at pronouncing that, and maybe I'll get better throughout the day. And I'm hosting up here now. Now we have a real human person rather than a screen. And I want to now welcome to the stage the wonderful Una Kravets. She's a UI engineer at DigitalOcean. And so what does a UI engineer do, you ask? Or rather, I asked her last night. And the way that Una put it, she focuses on building things well. So she works with designers to build out interfaces to be the most accessible, the most performant, and the best that they can be. So I can't really think of anybody better to teach us about practical blend modes. And if you're anything like me, I've not really looked much into blend modes. So I'm really looking forward to getting a really solid introduction to this. If we have time, we're going to have a Q&A afterwards. If you have questions, save them up, write them down, or send them to me in a tweet at Laura Kalbag. That's Kalbag, my surname. And if we have time, I might ask your question for you. So anyway, I'm going to hand you now over to the capable hands of Una.
Awesome. Welcome. And thank you for having me. So I really, really like blend modes and filters. I think that they are an awesome tool that we have on the web, and you can do some really cool, exciting, creative things with them. You can use the random function in Sass to sort of play with colors, create these gradients, use different shapes, make randomized bokeh images by applying portraits with something in CSS that you can apply and blend together. You can just blend images with different ways of colorizing them against each other, seeing how those pixels interact, animate them, make them move across the page. You can apply infrared effects. So instead of buying, a nice camera, getting the right filters, going out into nature, taking photos, with SVG or CSS, you can recreate these directly in your browser. And you can recreate 3D images out of one image by applying transforms and color and mixing the blend modes. This is lighten and darken, applied on the shadows and highlights and blended in a certain way to create this effect. And with the web, we have animation, we have interaction. It's really exciting, all the options that are out there. So I love to give this talk and sort of describe some of these different techniques, and if you're interested in any of those, you can go to this website, arttheweb.com, to get more detailed tutorials about how to do those things and how to create art online. When I give this talk, sometimes the reaction is, this woman saying, "Do you make money from your art?" And this kid says, "Yes," and she says, "Really?" And then this is me. I love him. So this talk is going to show you the other side of that, the practical side, how we can take these concepts and use them in real user interfaces. My name is Una. That is my handle online on all the things, so Twitter, GitHub, et cetera, et cetera. Find me online, ask me questions, feel free to. Like I was introduced, like Laura said, I work at DigitalOcean as a UI engineer. I started a couple of Sass meetups. I started one in Washington, D.C., and then Austin, Texas, where I lived. And I also host a podcast called Toolsday, which is 20-ish minutes on Tuesdays, and we talk about different tech tools, if you want to check that out. All right, so what I want to do is show you that blend modes aren't this super glamorous thing. They could be very practical, and when you blend those things together, you get something that you can use. So let's start with CSS filters, because CSS filters are the most simplistic way of applying some of these concepts in your UIs. And with CSS filters, we have 10 options. So here they are. I'm not going to read them all out. But the cool thing about filters is you can apply them on top of each other and blend them together in a list. So you can use all 10 of these if you want on a single element, or any of them individually. And they look like this. They take a few different input types. So blur takes pixel values. You can use any absolute value. So if you want to break your computer, use like M's or something, and it will never load because they're huge. Brightness is, you can go above 1, but if you go below 1, it will actually darken your image. That's good to know. Drop shadow takes something like an argument list, but most of them are 0 to 1 inclusive if you want to see the effects, such as grayscale. So you can play with those, mess around. To see how they interact, I think, is really interesting to see what the pixels are doing when you're applying multiple filters. And here's the browser support. So they're pretty well supported. Of course, as expected, IE doesn't support them. Firefox and Chrome do, Edge somewhat does. But there is a polyfill, and you can polyfill them with SVG filters. Fun fact, because CSS filters sort of grew out of SVG filters. And also DirectX filters if you're trying to support IE 6 through 9. A great example of how to use these in just a single line of code to improve your layouts is by just applying them to something like this. So this is an example I wrote, I think on an airplane. I used the Paper app to draw these illustrations on my iPad. And the Paper app has this gray background that comes with the images. But instead of having to open all these individually in Photoshop, edit them, make sure the background was white to blend into that page, all I had to do was open my DevTools, apply a single line of code, which was increasing the brightness, I could increase the contrast, and boom, they all fit. And it cascades down with just that one line of code and a class that I could apply to all these images. The other thing I can do is change the color of the heart and the paper airplane if I want to with the hue rotate. So really powerful things that you can do in individual lines of code. Here's something that we see pretty regularly in UIs as well. And this is just a sidebar that we want to focus on once you open it. So we want to sort of defocus the rest of that page. And what Dolce & Gabbana is doing on this site is applying an element on top. So we can dive a little deeper into that. What they're doing is applying sort of a black image with an opacity of 0.6. What you can see here is this RGBA is the color that they're applying in that background. So you have the RGB colors and the alpha. But if we use filters, especially one that I really like called backdrop filter, we can add to that. We can apply blurs. We can use those various options that we have, the 10 options that we have, to sort of string them together. Here I'm applying a hue rotate on top of that blur. And we can edit things like that brightness value. So since we could make it lighter, we could also make this darker. And if we make it darker, then we don't even need a background applied, because what backdrop filter allows us to do is apply filters behind the element that we're applying them on. So it's pretty cool. We don't need that background at all, and it's just going to apply that to the entire page through this class that we're accessing on the click of that hover state, of that open sidebar state. So this is a port for backdrop filter. However, there are workarounds if you want to create this effect. And the workarounds sort of look like this. So in this example, we're making that text a little bit more legible by providing a blurred background. And this is something that we saw in OS X, and something that we can do today on the web. So I found this example in CodePen. As you can see, it's live. It's using Draggable to sort of just show this effect wherever you put it on the page. It's going to take that same background image and sort of blur it. So this is a hack. And the way you do this is by using a fixed background. So what we're doing in this example is applying a fixed background to both the background of the page, or just having it covering the page, and then also to that text element with the what says Munich, Germany on it and the text inside of it. So that background in that element is the exact same as on the page. And when we scroll or move that around, because it's fixed and because it's covering, we're actually just revealing different parts of that image on the page. So what you can then do is apply your filters. You can apply your brightness filter to make it a little bit easier to see, a blur filter, and we get the same effect by using just cover and fixed on this background. So that's exactly what this other example was doing as well, until we get backdrop filter, which doesn't look very likely, unfortunately. So other things you can do are revealing images. Does anybody want to guess what this is? A wild Eevee has appeared. I caught 2 this morning here. And also just showing text and making text more legible if you wanted to sort of do the opposite of that and apply text on top of images that you're hovering. I really like image filters for hover because it means that you don't have to create a separate image that you're going to apply as the hover state, which means fewer network requests for your page. And you can just apply these filters to that image on hover, which allows users on hover or focus to understand what they're doing, where they are around that page, without having additional requests being sent over to them. And this is just a good example of the various possibilities that you can do when applying and blending these different filters. No pun intended. Speaking of blending, let's talk about blend modes. That was just a short overview of filters. They're pretty self-explanatory, but blend modes I want to dive a little bit deeper into so we can understand what's going on here. So with CSS blend modes, we have a few more combinations, and they come in different groups. The first group will darken your image, as you can see, which are darken, multiply, and color burn. Then we have lighten, screen, and color dodge, which, as you might have guessed, will lighten the image. Overlay, soft light, and hard light are all a group. Difference and exclusion we'll talk about. And then hue, saturation, color, and luminosity, which are all parts of a color group. So this is the support for background blend mode. Background blend mode is one of the two ways that you can use blend modes on the internet. Background blend mode applies to an element with multiple backgrounds, and then you can apply that blend mode to those backgrounds encapsulated within that element itself. What mixed blend mode will do, and here's the support for that, is it will apply that blending to the elements around the one that you are applying the blend mode to. So if you're layering on top of other elements in the page, you'll see what that layering effect is. You won't see that with background blend mode because background blend mode only applies internally to the backgrounds that you've selected, which could also be useful. And there is a polyfill for background blend mode with Canvas. You can recreate a lot of these effects. There isn't a polyfill that I've currently found for the mixed blend mode, however. So here's multiply. Multiply is probably the most common blend mode that you've heard of, and multiply sort of works like a transparency. So multiply is taking the luminosity value, that's like the dark and light, and multiplying, literally, those values on top of each other. So if you think of a transparency, if you're overlaying 2 in front of the light, any dark areas will appear dark, and if you're laying another color on top of that that's darker, you'll get an even darker result. But if it's white or a light color, like a light yellow here, it'll probably shine right through. And this is, I like to use this as an example because it shows the depth of those colors when they interact. So when these colors are multiplied on top of each other, you see the yellow stays bright where it is, but then where the blue and the pink intersect, we get like these dark green tones. And I think that's pretty cool to see how they interact there. An example of that online is just this plop of yellow color in the site. I thought it was really cool that you're making white text on yellow a little bit more legible by using this multiply, and it allows for this aesthetic to continue throughout the site. A way to provide some unique perspectives on web design, as we were just hearing about from Andy. Another thing that I love about blend modes is how interactive they are. You can see that this is live in the browser itself. It's not just a static image that you're providing to the user. So this XOXO site from last year, I really liked how, as you scroll, you can see that interaction. The CSS comp website for this year uses blend modes as well, and they use them in SVGs. So this movement is also happening on the page with these SVG blobs. If you click on them, they will slowly start to morph around the page, which is a nice interactive element. And they provide a pop of color with these gradients on these SVG blobs that bring the site to life. And we can also create experiences like this online, just with native elements themselves now. This was not possible a few years ago. We would have to use JPEGs or PNGs, create this in Photoshop first, then export it. But now we can just make these natively in the browser, which means that they're SEO friendly. We can have search engines search through them. They're accessible. People can understand what's going on in this without having to provide a separate caption. We need to stop getting our inspiration for websites from other websites. And Andy did a great job talking about this morning. He called websites a vibrant medium for creative expression. And I wrote that on my hand because I really liked it. It's a great thing to think about. We can get inspiration from, as he showed, comic books or architecture or fashion or even just nature outside. There's so much more out there to sort of bring inspiration from kids' toys. So with these blend modes, we can make this much more possible in the web today. And this is a wine label that I had the same effect as that first example. We can do this in native elements now. So that label, the title of the year, that can all be legible and accessible and searchable. The next one I want to talk about is screen. I like this example because it shows the difference between multiply and screen sort of right next to each other and how they can move together. So screen is the exact opposite of multiply. What screen is doing is it's taking the inverse of the active layer's luminosity pixels, multiplying them by the inverse of the background layer's luminosity pixels, and then inverting all of that. So the way that you invert luminosity is you subtract the value of that brightness value from 1. So you can see 1 minus A times 1 minus B, all subtracted by 1. So it's kind of like multiplying the light values. You're just doing the complete opposite. And you can use these blend modes and sort of interact with them in a lot of ways. I think video is a really interesting way to do that. So if we want to start with this portrait and then apply a snow video on top, since this is all live in the browser, we can just do that. We can just screen it, and we have an instant video created. And because this is in the web, we can then apply some filters. So I can apply a blur filter to make it a little bit more legible in the background. If I take away this screen, you can see just the effect of all that directly in the browser. It's interactive, it's powerful, it's something that can respond to the user. If we wanted to recreate that in a GIF as an example, you don't quite get the same effect. It's super janky, you could see that there are artifacts here, not really working out. But then the most shocking thing is when we compare the two. So here's the blend mode with the portrait. It's a big file size, I admit 3.6 megabytes. That's because this is a high quality big portrait I'm using in a presentation, and this video is a pretty long MOV. But then when you compare that to the GIF, 24.7 megabytes. So there could be some performance improvements if you use blend modes in your UIs. I really like this example of screen because it was just a daily UI that we see, and I thought it was a really clever approach to taking the advantages of these blend modes and applying them in just a menu. So the lighten blend mode is one of my favorites, and it's applied here through a gradient. So in this portrait image, what you can do is apply a similar aesthetic throughout your sites. As your users all have different images, how do you make them cohesive? Blend modes are a great way to do that because you're applying a lens on top of your images. So what we see here is a dark gray to blue gradient applied as a lighten blend mode. And we can tell because some of the shadows are sort of losing some of their detail. The way that that works is, look at the numbers. So we start with this pink color. If we want to lighten that by, say, like this blue color, we get this purpley violet shade in between here. So what's going on? Well, if we think about RGB values, if you remember, 255, 255, 255 is white. So that means black is 0, 0, 0. So let's compare the numbers. What is lighter, 190 or 40? 190. What about in the green value, the green channel? 25 or 160? It's 160. And then in the blue channel, it's 240. So that is how we get the value that we output through this lighten blend mode. So we're doing that every pixel on the image. And it kind of looks like this. Here I'm using background blend modes with lighten because I have multiple backgrounds in this page. And if I wanted to really wash it out, I could just make it all yellow. And as you can see, anything that is darker than that will wash out. So this is how you can apply lighten blend mode with a lighter color to create this effect. If you use a darker color like a navy or a gray, you can just sort of make a nice little vintage washout. Another example I saw on Dribbble was by Chris Allwood, and he was showing what lighten blend mode was doing with a gradient. I love using gradients for this because you can apply different planes of color in a single stroke. So here we're using this gradient applied with lighten, and it really brings color to this page. It gives it life. So it's really cool to see how we can just do this in code, online, in the browser. If you're using CSS gradients, you can test it in the browser itself, play with the color there, see what matches your aesthetic. Okay, so the next blend mode I'm going to talk about is color and the color group. So we have this dog and this rainbow to show you how that works. So we'll overlap that, and then we'll apply that blend mode to the rainbow. Now, what the rainbow is doing is maintaining its saturation and its hue, and it's applying that to the luminosity value of the dog behind it. So what that means is that dog could be a black and white image, and it would make no difference. The result would be the same. Now, there are other blend modes, such as luminosity, hue, and saturation, which work in the opposite way. If you're applying a saturation blend mode, we would only take the saturation of that rainbow, not the color, and the color, so the hue and luminosity of that dog behind it. And you can apply any of these individually on any of your elements. Here's an example of it. If you use a black and white image with this, you could save a little bit of image size with that as well, and still apply a nice shade of color on your UIs. And you can use it to, again, create uniformity in your interfaces or your websites. So I spoke at a conference a couple of, I guess it was like 2 months ago now. It was called CSS Day, and they used this purple aesthetic through all the icons for the speakers and all the images. And you can see here, as you scroll down, it created this uniformity. Even though everyone's photo is different, everyone has a different background, etc., you can just apply a single wash of color. So as I was scrolling, I noticed that one of the speakers didn't have this wash of color, and for whatever reason, this could be avoided with CSS. We can use the color blend mode to apply a pseudo element on top of this image, and then we have access to it in the browser. So since we're applying color, we can then go in and change that, see what works well, what fits in. Chrome has really good dev tools for this. They also have palettes. Firefox has great tools for filters. So we can just do that in the browser and see what works, save it, and we're done. So that works, but also if you want to think about browser support, if you're trying to support older browsers, we might not want to put a block of color on top of an image if that block of color isn't going to be getting the blend mode, right? We're blocking the images. So thinking about the Mansell color system, what we can do is apply a pseudo element behind it and apply the luminosity blend mode on the image itself. So that means that the image will maintain its luminosity, those brightness and darkness values, but apply that to the color behind it. So it kind of creates the opposite. And that way, if the browser doesn't support it, it's kind of like progressive enhancement. You just won't see a block of color behind this image. You still get your content across. With filters, it's not as big of a deal because, again, those images are still going to show through. You just won't get the filter on top of them. So embrace the cascade. If you have an idea in mind, you can pretty much recreate anything, especially with the use of SVGs. So I just kind of went through and looked at a few different Instagram filters and wanted to recreate them in CSS and built a little open source library out of it called CSSgram. Some of this is like a little animatable for hover effects, etc. And this is the URL for it. But it kind of shows that if you have an idea in mind, you can get from point A to point B with these filter effects combined with these blend modes. And this isn't the only thing out there. There's now CSSCo, which is ViscoCam's filter library. And there is colofilter.css, which is created by Lucky VJ. I love this one because towards the bottom you see these gradients and this splash of color, which is really reminiscent of that Spotify like end-of-year aesthetic that I thought was really cool and vibrant. So next I wanted to talk about overlay, and overlay is pretty unique because it combines two blend modes. So this is going to be combining the screen blend mode and the multiply blend mode, both at half strength. So the screen blend mode at 50% on the light values and the multiply blend mode at 50% on the darker values. You could see it in the border here. It's not just a plain white border, it really melds into the image. In the darker areas, you see less of a stark contrast in the lighter areas, and it just provides for a nicer, more subtle aesthetic here. I also found this recently online. What they're doing is using these blend modes for interactions on the site. And when it reloads, you can see it pull in. Like, you can't do this in Photoshop and just plop it on your page. This is something that we need these blend modes and filters for to create these really energizing, dynamic aesthetics on the web. I really liked this example on everlane.com. I found this because Rachel Neighbors sort of tweeted it. It's so cool. So they have this mixed blend mode of overlay, just one line of code, and the way that it interacts with that video behind it is really engaging. If we remove it, it's just that plain white text, but it doesn't create the same aesthetic as if we apply a blend mode and see this video interact with the text above it. Again, that text is a part of the DOM. We can highlight it, we can read it with screen readers, we can read it in search engines. And it creates a cool, unique aesthetic that I think we're not seeing yet on the web. So next I want to talk about difference, kind of show a little example of if that was difference in the last one. And difference is a great way to cheat on children's games. Does anybody remember these from like childhood? You'd get these magazines, spot the differences. Do you see any? Like the ketchup bottle is one, like green cap, there's a little thing on the plate. So what difference does is it takes the difference, so it subtracts the active layers on every channel, the RGB and A channel, from the background layer, and then takes the absolute value of that. So similar pixels will turn black. With exclusion, similar pixels will turn a 50% gray. So if I hover this, we clearly see all the differences there. It's kind of how it works. It was originally used for lining up transparencies to make sure that prints were what we expected. So you can use that on the web as well. So I kind of described this to Sarah Drasner, who then came up with the idea of, oh, well, if we can use difference for kids' games, why can't we use it for visual regression testing? Brilliant, of course. With one line of CSS, you could see changes in your UIs, in what you've built, and see if there's any regressions there. So then I took that idea and built this site called diffy.me, where you can do just that. You can paste in your URL from maybe your production code to your local development environment and see if you've made any visual regressions or what changes you've made. This works internally because it's just going to be taking whatever URL you put if you have access to it. So just a really cool way to use blend modes in very practical terms online here. Okay, so filter effects. I love filter effects. These look a little complicated, but once you understand what's going on behind the scenes, they're much easier to work with. Okay, so before we get into filter effects, I do want to talk about how we're killing our eyes and not sleeping well with blue light. Have you heard of this app called Flux? Yeah. Has anyone used it? A few of you. I used it for a little while. It helps you sort of ease and rest your eyes at night and helps you sleep. And this is sort of why. So we're going to educate ourselves here.
The impact of screens on sleep. You know, people are exposing their eyes to this stream of photons from these objects that basically tells your brain, stay awake, it's not time to go to sleep yet. So it's 10 p.m., it's 11 p.m., it's 12 p.m., you're checking for email, you're looking for text, you're doing all these things. That light beams in you. It tells your brain, don't secrete melatonin yet, it's not time for sleep. And you're up at 12:30, you're up at 1, you're checking some more because you're up after all, why shouldn't you check? Now, you go to bed at 1, you wake up at 6 to get ready for work, that's 5 hours of sleep. We now know that what sleep is likely doing is allowing your active neurons to rest, which is fine. But more than that, the supportive cells, called glial cells, are now cleaning up the toxins that the neurons produce. And if you don't get from 7 to 9 hours of sleep, you just get 5, the toxins remain there for over 95% of people. There are a small percentage of people who are genetically different, they don't need that much sleep, but for the vast majority of us, we need 7 to 9 hours of sleep. So even though it's like a badge of courage, I only had 3 hours of sleep last night and I'm working today, it makes your attention falter, your memory is impaired, your ability to think through problems is challenged. Your insulin even, that helps regulate your metabolism, is turned upside down, so you're more likely to gain weight from what you eat and eat more. And then, if that weren't enough, it's actually toxic to the connections in your cells. So, in your brain. So what you want to do is prioritize sleep. Shut off your screens, let's say by 9 p.m. Give yourself an hour at least before you're going to bed and keep those screens off. It's a serious, serious problem for everyone, and we can do something about it by actually actively deciding that's what we're going to do, is take care of this aspect of the digital domain.
So that problem is exactly what something like Flux is trying to solve. We can also solve it with SVG filters. So if we can figure out how to create something like this, reduce some of that blue light, we can just recreate these RGB channels with SVG. And the support is pretty good. So this is definitely something that you can toy around with today, and production probably most likely, because SVG filters are even polyfills themselves for things like CSS filters. So the way that we can do this is through this property called FE component transfer. And FE component transfer composes functions. So this works on the RGB and A channels, all as individual functions. This is how we're going to apply this FE component transfer. And there are a few different ways, types of using this. We are going to talk about linear and gamma, but you can also use a discrete and table if you want to look into this for more information about it. So linear, we are going to go back to the days of middle school math, y equals mx plus b, to talk about how this works. Basically, you have your slope-intercept form. You have your intercept, and then the slope is that rise of a run. So when you're using the linear type for FE component transfer, you have those options. You have type and slope and the intercept. With gamma, it's a curve value that we have access to. So people use gamma correction with photographs because what you see and what the camera sees and what the screen sees are 3 different things. So if you're going on a hike with someone and you're in the woods and there's a beautiful backlit forest scene behind them, you can probably still make out all the detail in their face. But once you snap that photo, it's just a blurry outline. It's just a whole like black mass. And you're like, what happened? It's because the camera's not seeing that live scene like you do. Your eyes adjust. So with gamma, what you can do is on that luminosity channel, on the alpha channel, sort of apply a curve to lighten up the dark areas but keep the light areas where they are. And with gamma, we have amplitude, exponent, and offset as our options. So let's go back to flux, and we can create our own flux in SVG in just a few lines of code, now that we know how the SVG component transfer works. So let's take this little demo and convert it to this. Very subtle, but it is getting rid of some of those harsh blues that our eyes might be seeing, maybe easing that experience for your user. So I opened this in a photo editing program, messed with the channel values a little bit to get what I thought was not very accurate, but close enough sort of just for demo purposes, and came up with this line and this graph here of the RGB channels, keeping alpha the same. So then we could take that and transfer that into an FE component transfer. Pun definitely intended there. So we're using the RGB channels. As you can see, that red channel is slightly up. It has an intercept of like 0.05, but the slope remains the same. With the green, the slope is a little bit steeper, and then with that blue, it's having a negative intercept. So you can transfer this just directly, as you can see from this graph. And then in JavaScript, in about 2 lines of code, we can get the date, get the time, and then say between 20 o'clock and 5 o'clock, we'll add a class to the document's HTML, call it flexible 1600K for a temperature. In CSS, again, with 1 or 2 lines of code, depending on if you're using auto prefixer, you can just reference that SVG. So what we're doing here is assuming the SVG is on the page itself. You can also use external SVGs within an image folder or wherever the rest of your assets are, and reference those as like /image/filters, then get the hash, which is going to be the ID of that filter. But you can only do this if it's hosted on the same domain, or you're going to have cross-origin reference issues. So just keep that in mind. But that's one way to access these filters. And then the result is something like this. Between those hours, in like 6 lines of code, we've recreated Flux. The next SVG method I want to talk about is FE color matrix, which is super, super powerful once you understand what it is. And people often use sepia to sort of describe it because it's one way to describe and sort of demonstrate the difference between SVG filters and CSS filters. So the top one is the SVG filter using FE color matrix, and the bottom is a CSS filter. So much more complex to look at. But when you understand what's going on, it has a lot more control over the values. And the values are so small because they all reference any number from 0 to 255, like we will see in RGB values, but divided by 255. So that's how you get those small decimal numbers there. And we'll see that in a second. So if you look at FE color matrix, you can break this up by the grid itself. The first row is going to be your red channels, the second row is your green channels, the third row is your blue channels, then you have your alpha channel, so that luminosity, and your multiplier. That's what the last row is, that's what the column is. So you start with those values, and a default FE color matrix looks like this second square here. It's R, you get 1 for your red channel, then zeros all the way across. The greens are 0, 1, 0, 0, 0. And you can see the point. It kind of just goes like a little diagonal down. But if you want to start messing with these channels, say we want to colorize something green, remove all the red and blue in it, we can just keep that one value for green and then completely remove the red and blue, as we can see in that bottom example. And that will look like this. All the red and blue is gone. The luminosity remains the same because we didn't mess with the alpha, but we see the green shine through. There's a great tool online if you want to mess with this more that allows you to just sort of click and drag and see what these different channels do if you're looking for a specific effect. And here is the link to that. So if you want to take a picture and reference this later, castkick.github.io/svg-color-filter. And it's a really great tool for starting to get your hands dirty with some of this stuff and see how they interact with the images that you're providing. So once you get the basics of that, you can do some pretty cool things. Here is an example in JavaScript that is using FE color matrix to dynamically create this duotone effect. It takes two arrays of values, and that's going to be your RGB channels for your highlight and your shadow, and it automatically generates whatever duotone effect you want. No Photoshop, just open it in the browser and edit, and then boom, you have what your intended effect is. And here you can see this is how Jose Perez is creating this matrix. He's going through and getting your values and then doing something like this. So since we have two colors, right, we have an R1 and an R2, and on any of these channels you can do it, but he did it in the red, so I'm just showing that as the example. You subtract those two values and you divide them by 255 to get that inclusive of one value on a single channel. And then the shadow color is also going to be your multiplier there. So you take that shadow color for the red channel, the green channel, and the blue channel, and you divide that alone by 255. So as an example, if we wanted to do a red highlight, like true red, 25500, and a true blue shadow, it will look crazy. But this is how you do it. You can get some pretty absolute values this way, just doing the math and understanding what's going on there. So yes, while they look complex, if you understand what's happening in the different channels and columns and rows, you can get very specific effects for your images. So like I said, that was on the red channel. You can also do it on the green channel or the blue channel to get similar effects. It just depends on what pixel values are shining through in the images that you have. So I saw this on this blog, Innis.io, and so Innis Montani did this really cool effect on all of her blog header images. She used a duotone effect as sort of the intro image and created this aesthetic that matched throughout the blog, very colorful, but didn't do this manually by hand, didn't have to open Photoshop for all of this. She used Jade, which is a sort of static site engine builder, to sort of put the data of all the images in a single data file, applied sort of just two different properties for each of the posts, which was just the image itself, the link to the image, and the colors she wanted, and then used that JavaScript very small amount of code, that function that built these automatically and generated new matrices into this SVG that she applied in the page. So this is just all done in a few lines of code here in a very organized way by using FE color matrix. So in review, CSS is pretty awesome when it works. Just a big caveat sometimes. So don't do these things because browser support might be an issue. Remember, there are polyfills, and you can sort of affect layer order if you have to and progressively enhance your sites. Performance could be an issue. Of course, it's going to be faster if you do these in your graphic editor and then apply them on the page rather than have the additional paint time to re-render the image. So keep that in mind. It's a very small amount, though, I swear. You can't save the images either. If you want to save them down and keep them locally, it's a lens. It's a lens on top of your images, so you're not going to be able to save the effect with the image unless you do a screenshot. And that means if you want to share this image on Twitter or Facebook, again, you're not going to get the filter on top of it. You're just going to get the core image itself. So there's not any thumbnail support. But do try this because it could improve performance. I think specifically with videos, this could be really helpful and different ways that the user can interact with your site. So just kind of like the example I showed before, if you're using really performant formats, applying filters could be useful there. Flexibility, because it allows your users to interact with the UI itself instead of just presenting a static page to the user. Consistency, because of that cascade, and we could just have a single class, apply some filters to it, cascade it throughout all of your components, all of your elements that you want to apply this to. It helps with speed of prototyping. It's very fast to sort of open the dev tools, play with the colors, apply the gradients directly in the browser, see what it looks like. Pair design, pair programming is really a good way to sort of quickly prototype by using these effects. Accessibility for the artistic designs. Something that we saw was those like wine labels, those sort of components that you can now create directly in your browser, make them a part of the DOM. And exploration. This is really important. I like this site a lot. It hasn't been updated in a bit, but it's called evolutionoftheweb.com. And it shows sort of where we were and where we are in a timeline. It's really interactive. It's a cool website to check out. But if we take a look, like this is where CSS3 animation is. Like it's really new, but we see it, it's very prevalent these days. Here's Flexbox, also very new, but very prevalent. But then here's filters. Like here's CSS filters, they're babies. Like this is just the start of this technology, and where it could be going is really kind of up to us, like where we're gonna be pushing the browser. The only way to push the web forward is to build something that pushes the web. So be an explorer and art the web. Thank you.
Wow, that is so much cool stuff. I'm coming away from this completely inspired and have about 1 million ideas that I'm going to try to get away with on the company website.
That's awesome to hear.
Does anyone here have any questions you want to ask Una after that wonderful talk? Well, I've got questions, so yeah. So I was wondering, you talked about polyfills and you talked about progressive enhancement. And so in terms of using all the different, but I guess largely visual techniques here, what would you usually go for in your day-to-day work? Would you polyfill it or would you use progressive enhancement?
So specifically with filters, in production, I would actually say if you need a polyfill, if you're concerned about supporting those browsers, I wouldn't use the filter. Because then you're applying additional dependencies, and it's kind of right now more for experimental work or production sites that aren't as worried about IE6. If you're using IE6 still, I think there are more difficult fights to fight in that company than filters and blend modes.
Yeah, and it must work quite well because you can, of course, default to nice basic images and sort of simple designs, and then you can just layer so much on top of that with
exactly.
such lightweight code as well.
Yep.
Anybody else have another question? Because I've got more if you haven't. I'm hoping for later sessions that you're going to come up with ideas. I know that probably because Una covered so much, so comprehensively, this is probably why there are so many questions.
It was a lot of content.
Yeah, but in a great way. And actually following up on that, are you going to have your slides somewhere that we can find them? Or all your resources in general, maybe?
Yeah, I can post my slides. I think it's a little difficult to kind of grasp the concepts from just seeing the slides, because
I completely
here's
agree.
a picture.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can definitely share the resources to all the polyfills and different examples that I shared.
Yeah, all the
and
cool
some of the
links
tools.
would be really great. I'm
Cool.
going to go back and get at that, definitely. So you also show a lot of examples from CodePen, and obviously CodePen is great and everybody loves it because it makes it so easy. Are there any other places where you would go to kind of trawl for inspiration and ideas on the ways different people are using blend modes, aside from just in the web in general?
I like to also go to Dribble, even though they're not applied in code. It's a cool way to see things that are possible that may not have been explored yet. Also, I use a tool called Panda, which is a little Chrome extension. Every time I open a new tab, you can customize it. So I think I have GitHub, Dribble, and like CSS tricks on there, but you can customize it and just do like all images all over the place. There's like Lobster, there's designer news that has occasional like bursts of inspiration. There's a lot out there. Design Sponge is another place that you can find design inspiration. It's not just websites about websites. So there are things out there.
How do you, so when you're finding all of these things, what is your process that gets you to this point? Do you use RSS, do you use Twitter or something to keep up on following different people, finding out the latest things? Do you just always go to these various sites?
I definitely use Twitter for most of my tech news information. I also follow a couple of podcasts and listen to those for whatever's coming out in tech, things I should be sort of exploring. Twitter's a great resource, though, especially since it's so personally curated. You can always add Like if you want to follow more designers, then add more designers. If you want to follow more React.js community, then you can follow the React.js community. And that's sort of my favorite thing about Twitter in terms of finding inspiration.
Is there anything that you wish you could do with the kind of similar technologies to blending and filtering that you
Backdrop
can't?
filter. I wish backdrop filter was a thing. Yeah.
Well, we're a little early, so come on, I want to give them opportunity. Aha, it's so dark and your hand is so down. Thank you, it'll be really nice. I'll bring the mic down here if we haven't got a roving one going on. Yeah? Cool.
Hi, I'm Adrian. Thank you for that talk. I recently got a Photoshop filter file from an agency, and they want us to apply all those filters to all our images on the website. And I was, no, I don't want to do that in Photoshop. So thank you for that inspiration. And my question is, are you aware of any resources like, can I upload my Photoshop filter somewhere and it gives me automatically my SVG filter for this? Or is there any kind of comparison of which Photoshop filter can be done in SVG? Like any resources about that?
I'm not aware of any just like sort of pull in and see what the output is right now, but I think that'd be a great open source project.
Okay, let's do this together. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, first person to make that tool, please tweet it with the FEC16 hashtag, because I think a lot of us would want to use that, that's for sure. Have we got any other questions? Come on. Do you use any of it in production on the DigitalOcean site at the moment?
Not on the DigitalOcean site. I have used it on sort of personal projects and smaller microsites, and we're sort of coming out with little, there's a few initiatives that are coming out, so I've been experimenting with it on those, but we just did a redesign, launched it 3 weeks ago now, but that was really focused on minimizing all of our assets, like really focusing on performance and accessibility. So we haven't really had a chance to experiment much outside of that realm yet for that.
Yeah, it's one of the things you don't want to add it in for the sake of adding it to a site. You want to make sure that you have a solid design and aesthetic that works with it.
Yeah, and I think specifically for editorial work, it works really well because that's a place that you're providing a lot of content, so you need to figure out how do I make this content really draw a user in. And I think that like blend modes and filters are a way to do that without having to like create all these additional dependencies and load your user up with that. You can just use native. Like SVG, I think, is a great way to do it because you can create these really small file sizes and just in the code make that interact with your page. So not just like show it, but also as they scroll, things can move not too much, but also like resizing the page, you can have different layout types. And yeah, I think there's a lot of application for this. In production, it just hasn't been used much yet.
I love how well that ties in with Andy's talk.
Yep.
How perfect that you are following him and that he was talking about us trying to be more creative, and then you're bringing all of these techniques that you can use so creatively. Do you think that because you kind of work in collaborating with designers in your day job, and so you're sort of helping build the things and realizing the things that they're coming up with, do you think this is the kind of thing that front-end developers should be communicating with other designers about, that they can do all of this and they don't need to be relying on this software to do it for them?
Yeah, I think this is sort of the job of a front-end developer, and that's taking a design and sort of working with it to make it performant and accessible and build that the best way they can. So sort of sharing that expertise. I really like working with designers personally that don't know how to code, because A, it's a place that you have a moment where you can educate, and B, it's a challenge. If you build something thinking about how I'm going to like code this out, you're much less likely to be as creative with it, rather than if you're coming at it from a completely different perspective and saying, what can we do here? And sort of like building that out together. I think that's really like that paired designing is where you can create the magic of what the web can be.
Well, I think that is a great point to draw to a close, and then maybe we can get in and slowly a few people at a time get the lunch bag so that we don't have a massive blockage. I know that we've probably got a lot to discuss between us about all the different things we've learnt so far this morning. And I also wanted to say that if you want to know a little bit more about rendering performance when it comes to things like this, it'd be worth coming back here to see Martin speak at 2 p.m. this afternoon, because I think he's got some things that are pertinent to that. So, enjoy. Remember your badge.